What's going to happen in politics after health reform, after the sky falls, of course, is financial regulation, Wall Street reform.
Our big priorities for the president after we get health care reform done. First is financial reform.
We are a year and a half out from what Michael Lewis calls the most purely financial economic disaster in history. And the American financial system is still scudding along under the same rules, the same disastrous lack of rules that pierced and bled out the U.S. economy at the end of Bush's second term. And a collapse so spectacular, the graphs don't really need captions. We still haven't fixed the rules. Senator Chris Dodd today introduced proposed legislation for some new rules. Republicans in the Senate have already said that even though the Dodd bill incorporates many of their suggestions for softening the new rules, they still plan to vote en masse against the new rules anyway. Joining us now is Michael Lewis, yay, who has written way too many of the best modern nonfiction books ever written, including Moneyball, Liar's Poker, The Blind Side, and now The Big Short, Inside the Doomsday Machine, which explains the financial crisis from the perspective of several men who got rich foreseeing and then betting that it would happen. Michael Lewis, thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me back.
I've I completely immersed myself in the book, and I feel like it. Yeah,
that's a new experience.
Want to see my notes?
You really read it. You got all the way to the end.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's great.
No, I mean it's. Can we start with something that's probably academic, but I think hugely important?
Sure.
This is not about the stock market. This is about the bond market.
That's right. The whole crisis is about the bond market.
Yeah,
I mean,
what's the difference?
Well, stock market is where the shares of companies are traded, and where average Americans, middle-class Americans, have been investing for a long time, and it's a politicized market because the little guy is there, and it is, compared to the bond market, heavily regulated. You wouldn't know that from the Madoff debacle, but nevertheless, it's much easier to rip people off in the bond market than the stock market, and that's because it's largely an institutional market, regarded as a place where everybody's a big boy, and so stock market has real people in it, and bond market has other institutional people in it, and it has some real people in it, but generally the market is an institution. Yes, it's big institutions, and generally the behavior in the bond market is much worse. It's much more the Wild West than in the stock market, and it is sort of expected if you're a big institutional investor and you're dealing with a Wall Street firm in the bond market, they might be trying to do something bad to you. Yeah. And the biggest bad thing they did was the subprime mortgage bond debacle.
Well, and part of the reason that people are excited that you personally have written this book is because of, I mean, credit default swaps on mezzanine tranches of diversified asset-based securities. I mean,
that's a problem.
It's right. Yeah. Those are a problem.
But there's a reason. There's a reason for that language.
Right.
And it's so you won't understand it.
Yeah. You think it's deliberately designed to be obtuse?
Oh, absolutely. It's a common look. All trades have their professional jargon. All occupations have their language that's in part designed to keep outsiders out. But there's nothing like Wall Street. I mean, the blizzard of acronyms and the complicated words for things that don't need to be so complicated. It is, in fact, a form of opacity. And that it is just generally true that the Wall Street firms in the middle of the bond market work very hard to make their market opaque to customers, to regulators, to everybody, because an opaque market is a much more profitable market. I mean, one of the big things that needs to happen is total transparency. I mean, the bonds and the various derivatives of bonds should all be traded on screens, on exchanges, and everybody should be able to see the price. It would change behavior in the market, but they don't. The biggest, most important transactions in the bond market are bilateral transactions in between people that are never seen. No one ever sees.
And there's no public access to what that trade is or what it is that they're moving
around. And the prices in the bond market are all over the map, because
nobody knows what the price should be.
What the right price should be, and that's not a healthy, functioning market. I mean, there are parts of the bond market that this isn't true of. The market for U.S. Treasury bonds isn't like this. It's a very highly functioning market. But the market in more abstruse securities, like subprime mortgage bonds, is not a highly functioning market. It's a market filled with inefficiency and with deceit.
Fraud.
Deceit,
I guess, more specifically. I just interviewed Harry Markopolos, the Madoff whistleblower.
Yeah.
And he says that it wasn't actually a secret that Bernie Madoff was a Ponzi scheme. Some people knew They were just too busy making money off parts of that scheme themselves to take care to end it. You document something of the same dynamic for the financial crisis.
It's very hard. The financial crisis, as I describe it, I think it really is this period from kind of early, well, there's a prehistory, but the interesting period is kind of early 2005 to late 2007. By the end of 2007, there's nothing left to prevent. That all the bombs have been laid in the places. They're going to go off. The crisis is going to have just a question of when. But in that period, when this, essentially what happens is Wall Street firms create a way to lend money to people who shouldn't be lent the money. But it's very profitable to lend these people the money. And in order to do that, though, you've got to disguise the risk involved. And they've developed elaborate ways to disguise the risk involved. And they got so good at it, oddly, they disguise the risk from themselves. It's sort of like you tell a lie often enough, you believe your own lie.
Especially if you get $100 million every time you tell
it. Yes, but this is the problem. You know, when you ask even the people who are most cynical about what happened, were they crooks or were they delusional? You know, did they believe their lie or did they not believe their lie, kind of thing? Most of them will say that there's some crooks, but mainly they were delusional. That I think people were in this story I've written. I mean, what interested me about the story was that it was as much, in some weird way, about human perception as anything else. That you had this set of facts in the financial world about the relative soundness of all these loans that were being made, and the vast majority of the financial world took those facts and arranged it into a pretty picture because it paid to do that. That a very small handful of people arranged it into a very ugly picture, and the question kind of was why? Why did they do that? And it turns out there were kind of deep character reasons for why they did it, but they were for one reason or another incentivized slightly differently. And so when you go about reforming this system, you've got to go out reforming the incentives of the people in it, because if you don't, if people will see what they're paid to see, and you've got to pay people to see the truth.
In finding these fascinating people who bet successfully that the system was going to blow up. I mean, it's the one-eyed doctor with Asperger's syndrome and the handsome guy who doesn't inspire confidence and says too much, who works in a garage in Berkeley.
You've actually read it.
I've actually read the book. You make these guys almost lovable, But
it really bothers you, doesn't it?
Well, instead of seeing the crash coming and warning the rest of us, they see the crash coming and think, how am I going to get giantly rich off of this?
True. But only partly true, because they also went to the SEC, they went to the newspapers, they screamed to high heaven about what was going on. Nobody wanted to hear it.
Once they knew they were going to make hundreds of millions of dollars off of it.
Yes. But you know what? If everybody had thought the way they thought, none of this would have ever happened. Right. It's very hard to get upset with them for being smart when the real diabolical behavior was so stupid. I mean, the real problem was these big Wall Street firms became the dumb money. If everybody had sort of approached the investment business the way these people did, we wouldn't have our problems.
Yeah, it helps if you read. You know, it helps if you're interviewing somebody to read the book, and it helps if you are investing millions of other people's money, millions of other people's dollars in something, to read the prospectus, which only the guy with Asperger's did.
As he said, only someone with Asperger's would read a subprime mortgage bond prospectus.
Michael Lewis, author of The Big Short, right now the #1 book in the country, deservedly so. I always feel really honored when you choose to come on this show, because I know you could go anywhere, so thanks a lot.
Well, thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.